Okay, so now everybody's gonna join. Okay, we'll give it another second.
And Anna, I'll just admit people so you don't have to worry about that while you're talking.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. I do think we're going to have Senator Watson join us later because that's email with his administrator earlier today. So last meeting, we'll just recap that. The board, Ashley and Michael, I need slowly gave us a little overview of the proposed bill for 476 and just some general, I guess, some generalities around why they want to make the move and some of the general support of the move and how other states are similar, have been set up similarly. I read through the OPB research that showed that we had we looked nationally, they just looked regionally, so we just kind of went through that general stuff. The video was posted online last week or week before last, and the minutes are posted as well for anyone who may still be missing or wants to catch up. So just with that out of the way, I just want to get a vote to approve the minutes. We can move on. So council member is going to have a motion.
A motion to approve the minutes. This is Sam Teasley.
Thanks, Sam.
I'll second. This is Kelly.
Okay, I'll say aye.
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 Awesome. Okay, moving on. So I wanted to kind of accomplish a couple of things today. Sam, do you know if Gabe's going to be able to join us or no? Sam Teasley.
I don't know if he's going to be able to join us. I know he's been traveling and just landed at the airport very recently.
Okay. But
I'll ask him if he's able to join.
Okay, I had emailed and texted him, but he may have just been in the air. So the other thing I kind of wanted to accomplish today. So last meeting, we kind of got a lot of information as a council, and there was kind of a lot to kind of go through in regards to putting a draft together. And council members, I sent out late yesterday a draft of the report, just kind of going through some general research on the real estate board, how they've been set up funding wise in the past, looking at the last several years. And we had gotten I got some more information from Ashley and Sully. I sent that out to you guys in regards to how they came up with their funding proposal, I guess, from the state of North Carolina that was sent out. So I wanted to have everyone have an opportunity, to kind of talk through the draft that I sent out, and then after that, if there are any more questions, now that we've had a time to kind of digest what we had heard and those sort of things, can ask questions to Ashley and Sully. So with that being said, I'll stop there if any council members have questions for me right off. Representative Earhart, I see your bubble lighting up. I don't know if you're trying to ask a question or I want to give you an opportunity if you are.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, sorry. No, I don't know why the bubble is up. That was not me trying to ask a question, but I can try to think of a good one if you want me to.
Sure, think of a good one.
No, I'm fine. Sorry about that.
No, I just didn't want me to keep cutting you off. That's the challenge of a virtual meeting. So, okay, so just for those who hadn't seen the report or hadn't really had a chance to digest it, what we did was kind of go through what the current practices are of the Pell's board. This doesn't necessarily change this bill does not change how the engineers and land surveyors are licensed. It's just where the licensing, I guess, lives. And what we went through was how it's set up under the Secretary of State's office, and just as some general comparison points for everyone, there have been a few boards in the history of actually the state that were not ever or not currently under the Secretary of State's office. So I did want to point out this as it was talked about last week. So the lawyers, the accountants, physicians, dentists, insurance agents, pesticide applicators, and pharmacists are all the professions that are not licensed by the licensed under the Secretary of State's office. It kind of seems like a mixed bag to me, so I was curious as to why those. So those on the record, the bar has always been the State Bar of Georgia associated with Supreme Court. It's its own separate thing, and it's its own separate thing. I'll leave it at that. The pesticide applicator licensing has always been administered by AG. And then the Office of Insurance Commissioner has licensed the insurance agent since the agency was established. And the Composite Medical Board has licensed physicians since that board was established in 1981. So just 4 professions in the history have left the Secretary of State's office. As was mentioned, the Real Estate Commission left in 77 due to a court decision, and then there was supplement legislation after that. And then in 2013 and 2014, the other 3 left kind of consecutively. So the Board of Dentistry and the Board of Pharmacy moved from Secretary of State to the Department of Community Health as an independent budgetary unit. They fully moved everything from Secretary of State. And then the Board of Accountancy in 2014, same thing. It was completely moved and set up as an independent budgetary unit attached to the state accounting office. So they were really just one that left and is still kind of attached to the Secretary of State's office. So I thought that was interesting information and wanted to make sure that was highlighted as we kind of go about our discussions, that though there are several, I believe 41 professions that the Secretary of State regulates or registers, really only 4 have ever left, and only 1 is still associated in any sort of capacity with Secretary of State's office. So I wanted to highlight that. And then I wanted to also follow up on some of our discussions regarding the Real Estate Commission's funding comparison. So it was, I guess for the record, so my day job is at the Office of Planning and Budgeting. So that budgeting side of things is pings my interests quite a bit. So it's curious how that has actually worked. So the Real Estate Commission was established after the court ruling and legislation. The legislation said that Pell's board said that its proposed budget is so that the state's, not the Pell's board, the Real Estate Commission says that its proposed base budget is so that the state appropriation equals approximately 85% of its income. So I was curious if that were, a handshake agreement versus what is actuality and what has actually been done in the past. So I looked at the last 3 fiscal years, and in 2019, the percentage of fees to budget was 72%, and then 74%, and then 55% in the last fiscal year. So I just thought that was interesting. I thought you guys might be interested in that, because a promise is a budget. The appropriations process is the appropriations process. It's the appropriations process. So I did want to just note that in our discussions. So those were, we also highlighted, and Sam, this is kind of where I was hoping that Gabe might be able to join to speak on this, but in looking at the state as a whole, because we're looking at the state as a whole here rather than just a specific industry, we were looking at the cost inefficiencies of freestanding boards, right? Like quantities of scale. So there are other states that I can only speak anecdotally to, but Alabama has several different boards that are their own independent units that are the services that the state pays for are much higher because they're done in several different ways as opposed to just all of that all under one kind of entity. So that was one thing we highlighted as well. So I won't speak to any of necessarily the draft findings because they're still in draft, but council members, y'all have copies of the report if you have any specific questions. So I'll stop right there and see if there's any council members who want to discuss any of these points or have anything that they kind of want to bring up or ask questions. This is a little less formal than the last meeting of it's this person's time and this person's time. We're kind of just talking through. So I'll leave it there with council members if there's any questions that you guys have or want to discuss any of these kind of topics that we've come to at this point.
Hey, Anna, before we get to that point,
Uh-huh.
I just heard back from Gabe and he said he thought he had certainly intended to communicate that he was not going to be available. I thought he had communicated that, perhaps he didn't. He is currently on a train right now, so he is unavailable for the meeting.
Could you speak to any of the other sort of states, or you just want, we can just put a pin in Gabe for now?
I'd say let's wait on Gabe for that. I don't have that information.
Okay, that's fine.
Anna, I'd like to touch back on some things that you hit on here that I've been thinking a lot about with just how things are organized and budgeted, and looking at the notes. You said that I saw in the notes that there were 48 different industries that are regulated by the Secretary of State, and so I think the concern that's been raised that there's really not enough resources to go around with Secretary of State. I think relying on that to some extent concerns me in the analysis, because you're always going to have that issue with any of these industries. I think a lot of them that would like more oversight or more self-governance might feel that concern that they're not getting their references investigated or brought before the appropriate hearing body. And so spinning off a particular group into its own, essentially into its own budgetary category, because I think that's what it would be doing, is putting to the General Assembly on an annual basis that whatever the cost is, I've heard 600,000 or 2 million, but whatever it is, it puts the appropriators in a position where they're having to make a big budgetary decision about one particular industry group. And, you know, to some extent, I mean, I'm not an expert in appropriations, but I think to some extent the General Assembly does try to keep things stable and consistent from year to year and not make tough decisions. So at least as far as the different criteria we review, the cost effectiveness one really jumps out at me as by us at least not emphasizing that in the report, at least cautioning the lawmakers when they go to review this legislation that this is going to be a continuing question that's going to come up. And so, that might be something that our lawmakers may want to consider, is before we go too far down this path, that we have some criteria, that either GORC has criteria to evaluate these spinoff questions or the General Assembly does, just to keep track of all 48 of these, because other groups may come along and say, hey, well, we're not getting our cases investigated either, and we want to get administratively attached and have our fees appropriated back to us. So I think that's a big factor that I'm not really comfortable with. And part of that is I'm kind of new to GORC and I don't know what I don't know, but I do foresee that other groups could come along and raise a similar argument. So I just wanted to put that out there as a concern that I have in voting on the report.
And I think your head was down, but Gabe has joined.
Oh, Gabe. Sorry to make you join on a train, Gabe.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I just flew 12.5 hours from Geneva, and I knew the meeting was at 3, so I was trying to get on, but I'm on a train. I may go into a tunnel and may lose y'all. So if you have questions, we can make them fast, and I'll try to answer as fast as I can.
Well, Gabe, what I just wanted to hear from you, just as a representative of the agency, is we've talked a little bit about the cost of scale, and if you could just speak to how you guys, budget, not necessarily budget, but if we have a whole bunch of boards similarly to Alabama, kind of what sort of situation would that be put in?
Well, when you take an Alabama situation where they basically have individual freestanding boards, you obviously, it's hard to quantify how much savings we get for doing it this way. And frankly, some of the frustrations some of the boards have is that there's not enough investigators, there's not enough inspectors to do everything. And we should probably look at that in an overall way. We can still get an economy of scale on that, but we do have centralized intake processing, a single system that handles all this now that we are re-examining and looking at upgrading as well, the EMLO system. And having 42, depending how you want to count some of the boards, are sort of in limbo there, and being able to train people to do specific, to follow these processes the same way. You can move them back and forth in between things, in between different boards and agencies. We have people who will be processing in one board for a year. There'll be an opening, they can move over to another one, and the processes remains very similar. So you gain a lot of economies that way, because you don't have to double up on training. You don't have to do it over and over again. And again, I'm going to be wrong in the exact numbers of this, so I apologize for that. I think the state gives us about around 8 million or so. We pull in about 400,000 or so in retained revenue, and Alabama is something like 3 or 4 times that amount that they spend to do the licensing. Now, it's paid for by the fees, so it's not exactly taxpayer money per se, but I think from our point of view, a fee is a tax is a fee, and so forth and so on. I know that they've compared themselves to the real estate board, which runs decently, but it's a larger board and it has its own scale, and the engineers have their own scale. The problem is if we lose the groups that have scale, the smaller groups will never be able to support themselves or have enough fees to cover all the kind of integral information systems and staffing that they're going to need, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Kelly, did you have a question for Gabe?
Yes, I'm curious because, GSBA is attached to state accounting office, and I can kind of reiterate what Gabe is saying. So we have duplicate pay systems. I just had to set up their entire new Pay Easy system. They were moving from PayPal to Pay Easy. So my team is involved in getting all that set up. If there's a duplicate payment, it's myself or my accounting director that goes in and removes and refunds that payment, where Gabe's office has all that set up already. So I was curious, I don't know the history of why GSBA became attached to the state accounting office. I think that would be important for the council to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know either, so I don't have a good answer for that one.
Okay. But just experiencing it,
Mm-hmm.
there is some budgetary impact. We bill GSBA for all their back-end accounting, any kind of changes in their system. They pay for their own servers. They pay for a lot of that back-end foundation IT costs, administrative costs, separate from Secretary of State. So it's just something for the council to understand.
Okay. Well, since anybody else have questions for Gabe, we can let him get back to his training.
And I'll stay on just in case anything else comes up, but I can go back to mute so you won't have to hear the announcer and stuff in the background.
Well, thank you, Gabe. I appreciate it. I just thought it was important considering that SOS is kind of a large part of this particular study. I wanted to have y'all.
Well, I appreciate you wanting our feedback and input. And then,
Yep.
Sam has talked to me about it off and on over the last couple of months, and this has been going on.
Okay.
And we understand some of the frustrations, but some of that may be a budgetary issue to deal with the legislators as we try to leverage things versus. And I know what many organizations say is our people are willing to pay to get the better inspections and investigators and stuff, but there's still a way to do it, I believe, internal to the system that we have and achieve the same goals. But I understand the frustrations because we share them. So, but I wanted to make that clear too. All right. Well, I'm gonna go back on mute, but I'll listen in if anything else comes up. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Sully, I've seen your hand up. I just wanted to get to Gabe while he was talking. So I'll let you jump in.
Well, I just want to reiterate something from last week. I know not everybody was able to participate and maybe hasn't had a chance to review the video, but this was not our initial response. We didn't just, kind of wake up a couple weeks ago and decide, let's get out of the Secretary of State's office. We've been working on this for literally over 15 years. The Pels Board did a self-study back in 2005 to try to find ways to solve this problem internal to the Professional Licensing Board Division of the Secretary of State's office. We've worked with 2 separate legislative study committees over the years that have looked at this issue for all 41 licensed professions that are within the Secretary of State's office. And until just recently, really just towards the end of 2020, we were still working with the Secretary of State's office to try to improve the funding situation for all 41 licensed professions, not just ourselves. This was not our initial response. This is the response that resulted from a decade and a half of trying to work within the system and solve the problem. If anybody's concerned about a user fee as a tax as a user fee, those 41 licensed professions are currently paying $20 million a year in fees to the state of Georgia, and they're getting in return $8 million in funding.
It's a little more than 20, and I want to re-emphasize, he is saying exactly what happened. They've been trying to work with us to find solutions. They've been very proactive and productive. They have not been, being difficult. They've been trying to find honest ways to get to these things. I do want to reiterate that they have been trying to work within the system as they've gotten to this point.
Thanks, Gabe. I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah.
And I would also say we certainly appreciate the idea of economies of scale. We would simply respectfully suggest that there may be a difference between how you want to handle what we might characterize as occupations and how you might want to handle what are characterized as professions. And it's probably not a coincidence, although to Anna's presentation, the professions that are outside of the Secretary of State's office may be outside of the Secretary of State's office for different reasons. They may have always been out, they may have passed legislation to get out, but they are outside. And those professions, it's probably not a coincidence that those are doctors and lawyers and accountants and dentists and pharmacists, et cetera. As we said last time, if a barber makes a mistake, it'll grow back. If an engineer makes a mistake and buildings or bridges fall down, they don't grow back. So we would just respectfully submit that professions and occupations might be treated differently. And the concern about the slippery slope of, well, if we let the engineers do this, then everybody's going to want to do it. I'm not sure that's the case, but also we would submit by taking some of the perhaps higher demand professions outside of the Secretary of State's office, and assuming that the Secretary of State's office could maintain their current budget level, we actually think that improves the situation, because now the same number of employees and that same amount of budget can be focused on a smaller number of professions and perhaps give them more time and attention rather than having to divide it among a larger number of professions. So we actually think there's a good argument to be made that this, again, assuming that the budget could be maintained, budget levels could be maintained.
And I would submit that's a very large assumption to make.
I was going to say that.
Well, our proposal certainly, to Anna's earlier point, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, and the General Assembly appropriates as it sees fit. And the 85% agreement that the realtors have, obviously, it's not something that's achieved in every fiscal year, but we are certainly doing everything within our power, within our proposal, to propose something that would not have a negative impact on the general fund, therefore not create any demand or need for the General Assembly to reduce the PLBD's funding level. And that's certainly our intention, and that's certainly the way we have communicated with the appropriators as well as the folks in the governor's office.
Okay. Other questions? I want to jump in on if there's any other council questions. Okay, I will continue. So one other thing that jumped out to me is actually 2 things. The first being the proposed the proposed fee increase. So if my math is right, that's a 400% increase to 25% to 125.
As a political science graduate, I'm going to have to trust you on that math.
I have to check it. It's a pretty high increase. So my question on that is, and I understand that people do want to pay more for higher services. I do understand that, but I also am just genuinely curious. At what point is the board going to vote on that? Number one, because I looked through the legislation and it's not specifically indicated in the legislation what the cost change is going to be. So I assume that will be then done through a rule change. I guess my first question is, when are y'all planning to do that? And the second one would be, that is kind of the basis of, we'll raise the cost, then we can, have the fees and all that. So they're kind of like, what comes first, chicken or the egg? But then I'm sure you guys are all aware of the Professional Regulation Reform Act, or the Active Supervision laws. So I'm just curious, does the whole kind of profession, or the members of the Pels board, are they aware of this increase that's proposed? And what sort of what have you been hearing from some of the members? Like, is there some who are like, that's gonna increase our costs to, give, and limit passing it on? So I'm curious about that. Russ, if you want to speak to that, I'll let you go first, because you lit up first.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm chair of the licensing board currently, and I'll just say we've talked about this for the 7 years that I've been on the board. So Georgia has the lowest fees in the nation. Not even really competitive. So, I mean, you talked about Alabama a couple of times. So Alabama is double what our fees are, and to get all of that back in return, I think. And nor are we trying to become the Alabama licensing board.
Sure.
So I think that we're prepared to make that change immediately. And, when we went through the structural engineering licensing with you all last year, we had a lot of these conversations. And to do that, to make that bill successful, we pulled in a group of organizations. Sully leads one. We have the Structural Engineering Association of Georgia, SEOG. We've got SAMSOG, which is the Surveyors of Georgia. And so all those, and then GSP, Georgia Society of Professional Engineers. I think everybody agrees that Georgia has extremely low fees and are willing to get that adjustment. The counter to that is in the 7 years that I've been on the board, I couldn't tell you a single inspector or a single person doing the investigations. And you look at the drag out of how long it's taken to get the complaints processed through. And that's a combination of multiple things, but I don't think anybody sees the ROI to increase those fees without having a separate board. So I think from the board, I can safely say that if this was approved and we were moving forward with legislation, we would jump like that in terms of processing the proposed fee, but not before then.
Gotcha.
And to Russ's point, this has been discussed for, I mean, I've been in this job for 9 years. It's been discussed. The specific number, the specific fee amount has been discussed within all of the 11 engineering societies within the state of Georgia for years and years and years. Everyone is not just comfortable, but enthusiastically supportive of this. And to Russ's point, even with this increase, our fees in Georgia will still be among the lowest in the South.
Okay.
So, and as we mentioned in the last hearing, most of our folks, I think, are licensed in multiple states. So they're also very familiar from a firsthand basis with what that marketplace is, since they have licenses in multiple states.
And the one other piece to it is we're only talking in terms of what the individual licenses are. The business licenses, which when we look at business expense versus personal expenses, I think are completely different.
Yep.
It's $10 every 2 years, which is frankly a joke. And I think so you take that and then you take in any action items and fines that are associated with that. And that's an additional revenue that we're not considering here.
Yeah, I was just curious why y'all weren't proposing the increase in the business licenses too.
Yeah, what we've got to unpack, we got to look at the numbers. There's about, I think, is it about 1,200 certificates of authorization in Georgia? So in business licenses, we'll call them, through the Pels board. What we've got to figure out is how many of those are single engineers or 2 engineers, because we don't want it to be terribly impactful, where you raise the individual fee and the corporate fee, the certificate of authorization fee. So we just have to unpack that. But to Russ's point, I think it's probably likely that it would be a mix of fee increases.
And actually in board rules, Sully, we have exceptions that if you're an individual engineer and it's, say, for me, if it were Russ Pennington, PE Inc., then we are exempted from having to have a COA. So there is that option for those individuals.
Okay.
Yeah, the $100 fee probably was as much me kind of trying to keep the math simple as a political science major as anything else.
Sure. Sure.
That's sort of your worst case scenario.
Okay. My other question is, I like to live life by trust but verify. So not saying I don't believe you guys, but I am just curious that, we're looking at this from the, kind of an independent counsel's perspective. So in 2020, there was one case brought, I believe you said, but how many complaints were made that were brought to the council? So, because I'm curious if it was like 10 were brought, only one was done versus, 3,000 were brought and only one was done, because I know that y'all then said that people are, not necessarily wanting to bring stuff to the council either. So I'm just.
Yeah, I don't know if it's that they're not wanting to, it's that because there's been such a lack of enforcement and progress on cases for so many years that it's sort of perceived within the industry that there's really no point to it, that it's more trouble than it's worth because nothing's going to end up happening.
That's right.
Right.
We don't have a robust culture within the industry of assuming that if I file something, something will happen. So it's it is almost kind of a chicken and egg problem at this point, because it's been that way for so many decades. You almost don't have a good control group to figure out, well, how many complaints would be filed if people had any hope that there would be some resolution to it. Russ, you may want to speak to that more, but
yeah, actually, I think, Anna, it's a fair point, and I think you could, if you looked at it over the last 10 years and looked at the number of cases that were brought to the board versus last year, you would see a significant trend downward. And
I'd love to see the last 10 years of data, if you could send them to me.
I will see if I can get that. That's, that.
And Anna, just so you know, just so that you've got some idea, I think we pointed this out when Sully spoke last time. In 2020, the year of the pandemic, Florida processed 451 complaints regarding engineering practice, of which 372 were found to be legally sufficient. Alabama processed close to 100 cases in 2020, and they have 7,000 fewer engineers than Georgia does. But that gives you some ballpark ideas of what we should be expecting. It's not that there's not bad engineering going on in Georgia. People aren't doing nefarious things. It's just to Sully and Russ's point, people are just like, why would I even bother? Nobody's going to investigate anything. When Russ came to the board with slam dunk cases, they still didn't get prosecuted.
Okay. Prosecuting now is Attorney General, and that if y'all were still a board, your own board, it'd still be the Attorney General doing the prosecuting.
Well, just like the Real Estate Commission, though, you can contract either with the AG's office or contract third party.
Special Attorney General appointments.
Special Attorney Generals.
Not saying, again, I don't agree with you. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just trying to write a report with data and the number. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, the number one argument you guys are making here is that things aren't getting prosecuted and pushed through. So, like, what I'm missing here, I'm not saying it's not true. What I'm saying is it's anecdotal. And if you have the data, I would really like to see it so I can, there's only one case brought. So if you can provide that, that would be extraordinarily helpful to me, because I do, and showing what Florida has is important, but I'm just curious about what has been coming to Georgia, because again, if nobody, I understand that the last 10 years of or 15, whatever you guys were saying, there's been no producing, but again, the whole state has had budget issues and staffing issues and things like that. It's like a whole state over the last decade. And we came back through a recession, coming back up, 3 fiscal years ago, the whole state got cut, not just Secretary of State and Pell. So, it's just it's a whole state sort of trend here. So I'm just trying to get a bigger picture of things that have kind of come to the board that necessarily haven't, exactly how I would look at regular staffing stuff when you're looking at it from the appropriation side. What's the workload kind of a thing? So that sort of stuff.
We'll certainly try to get that information, and it may be a challenge in the sense that, in the same way that simply telling someone whether their application materials have been received and they can set for a PE exam is difficult to accomplish. Collecting this data and reporting on this data may also not be the highest priority of the staff. We'll certainly see what we can try to find out, working with the Pels Board staff to see what data we can assemble.
Yeah.
That they have.
Or just, how many cases
Yeah.
were brought last year?
100%,
I'm trying to write a thorough report, and there's a few data points that I'd love to have if available. So
using, I mean, we'll definitely do everything we can to get as much data as we can. I think it's also, to Ashley's point, sort of safe to assume that we don't have uniquely angelic engineers in Georgia as compared to Alabama or Florida. It's probably,
Sure.
similar levels, but we'd love to get that data too.
Yep.
Hey, this is Gabe, and I'm back again. I don't know if it was said or not, but we don't get reports to investigate very often, which is sort of a chicken and egg thing kind of thing. And I know what they've said before is it's never going to get investigated, so nobody reports them. But we don't have numbers because there haven't been that many complaints.
Okay.
And I do want to be clear. I know we've talked about just sort of like the last few years from a budget standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
The words we're using, the discussion we're having is identical to discussions I was having 9 years ago. Nobody's reporting, nobody's filing complaints. It's not unique to coming out of the recession or the pandemic or anything. It's something that's been, it's cultural, it's decades in the making.
I just mentioned that because it was mentioned in your survey and last year it was cut again. So that's why I brought that up. Okay. Any other questions from council members?
I just had a clarification question. So if an investigation is brought forward to Secretary of State, what is that path? So the investigation happens and then SOS sends it to the AG's office, or how does that work? Because kind of back to your point, is it really the AG's office? Is their backfill, or is it both parties? Someone can just clarify that for me.
Well, essentially what happens if there's a complaint brought, our investigators would investigate and they would present to the board, and the board would normally then vote to, do you just do a letter of discipline? Do you do nothing? Do you send to the AG's office? And that's the normal path for an investigation for many of our boards.
If I can add to what Gabe said, I have found in my experience, it's often come directly to the board members who then ask for an investigation to occur, and then it's scramble to find an investigator. The results of that then come back to the board, where we have an investigative committee on the Pels board, and then we make the recommendation to, action with the AG's office. But you're absolutely right, and the AG's office is engaged in this process, which further complicates the discussion, frankly. But
Thank you.
Okay.
Do you all see a lot of private lawsuits in lieu of like a state investigation? Do you see any like a robust practice area
yes,
prosecuting these?
there are a lot of things that get thrown at us that we can just simply say it's a civil case and that needs to be resolved in the court case, not the licensing board. But some of the complaints come directly from that.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that because, one of the factors is, hang on a second, I closed. One of the factors is essentially what all other means are there to enforce. And I'm not saying put it off on the courts, but, to the extent that there are cost recovery and attorney's fees that can be collected in these cases, that may be why you're not seeing a lot of complaints coming in, because people are filing lawsuits when these things arise. And to that extent, it can act as a deterrent to bad actors.
Ashley, do you want to respond?
It's Stephen. It's not just the lack of the investigations and keeping the public safe on that aspect. It really is. And we have gone through this whole process, trying not to throw anybody under the bus. But if I need to, I've got 100 emails that came in the span of 2 days about problems that people have had with the Pels board, or not the Pels board, but with the Secretary of State's office not responding to anything in a timely manner. So you've got people who need to sit for the exams. They've been told all the paperwork's in, then they can't sit. Nobody's returning calls in a timely fashion. We don't want to throw anybody under the bus. That is not the intention of this hearing. That is not how I operated when I ran the bill in House regulated industries or Senate regulated industries. I'm just telling you, there are ongoing problems down there from everything from the
And then I'm going
beginning,
to have to
getting
step in on
somebody
this
to
one for a
answer.
second right now, because we've had something going on for a very long time that's been driven mainly by the pandemic, is that everybody's been facing, and I think everybody knows this, over the last 2 years especially. We've gone from, we had 38 people in our call center, we're down to 24 right now. I had 10 people come in, 6 of them went through training, 3 of them got hired, 1 of them stayed longer than a week. That's just the reality of it right now. That's going to be the case whether they are on their own or not on their own. And also, we have an antiquated system that has been there for 20 years.
And Gabe's right, and I agree with all of that. But this has been going on way before Brad Raffensperger was Secretary of State. I mean,
we have the same problem that Department of Revenue that Gabe's talking about, though. So I know we're kind of devolving the discussion here a little bit, but that is kind of an issue with state government generally right now. Is wages are going up in the private sector, and we're feeling the pinch. But that's, I think that needs to be part of this discussion, is that maybe should temper the pace a little bit, because if it's an issue statewide that can be remedied in another way, then maybe you don't need to restructure an organization. And that's all. I'm just pointing that out as maybe a factor that goes in the report. I'm not saying we don't issue the report, but that to me is something within the purview of the General Assembly, because it does go essentially to how we're going to fund government. And I don't know that it's a place to really go too deep into that.
We certainly agree, and I'd just reiterate, we tried that, and that was the discussions we were having directly with the chairman of the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee. That was certainly our first approach, and one that we were pretty dedicated to until the end of 2020.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else have any comments or questions they want to make at this point?
Anna, I doubt you know this at this point, but do we have an idea, if this were to go through, who they would be attached to?
I believe they would be attached to SOS.
Okay.
That's correct.
Yeah, so it would be similar to the real estate board as can
Okay.
be, basically, from.
Thanks.
That's correct. It's identical to the structure for the Georgia Real Estate Commission, which has been in place for about 4 decades.
Okay. So, Russ, you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you. Back to Stephen's point, I'm very sensitive to kind of the competitive nature with those who want to work today. There's a major shortage of engineers, frankly, as well, not just in Georgia, but nationally. I'll just say, I mean, looking at the engineers have never been busier than they are right now. And with the workload that's coming from ARP funds specifically for infrastructure projects, and then infrastructure bills that are pending nationally. And I mean, in my 20-year career, I have never seen public spending for engineering and construction projects like is occurring. I absolutely get where Stephen was going in terms of we may want to pause this discussion, but I can tell you we are at a critical point that, if there's no regulation of an engineering industry that's stretched to the limits going forward, that's setting up for some really messy stuff up here. And going back to, Sully's point in the last meeting, it's a health and safety issue at that point.
Okay. So, what we are tasked to do as a council with this particular bill is kind of just scratching the surface on kind of what seems to be kind of a larger discussion. I feel like we could kind of beat this one around trying to solve lots of world problems for a while. So, I think this has been a good discussion around a little bit of clarity for what we're trying to accomplish with this report. So I would appreciate whatever data points that you guys could send me to finish up this report, because we're not taking a vote today, but next meeting, next Wednesday, is when I'd like to take a vote on this and kind of move on, because the legislature's going to need some time to look at it prior to session, and the other session that's going to start soon. So with that being said, like I said, Russ, anything that you can find would be great, just because I like to I don't like to write a report around anecdotes, though I'm not saying I don't believe you, trust me.
Hey, you're spot on with, if we looked at 2020 as one single data point for a number of complaints, we wouldn't have a whole much of a complaint or a case to you right now. So I hope I can.
That all I have is that there's only been one thing brought in 2020, and there's more than that. So I'd like to be able to write a report that shows, the accuracy of what's being presented. So, but that is the timeline we're working off of. So, whatever you can provide would be great. So anything else anybody wants to submit to me or reach out to, please have it to me by Monday at the latest, so I have time to get a report finished and sent out. I'll have this posted, minutes up by the end of the week, and probably this video posted tomorrow. But I thank you for everybody's time. I understand that this is a project that everybody's been working on, but this is a unique report that this particular report committee has worked on. So I want to make sure that we, I'm not unaware of the fact that we could be setting a precedent for another round of things. So I want to make sure that we're looking at it with the most kind of robust way. So anything else from anyone? Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, reach out to me if you need anything. And thank you for everybody's time. I really appreciate it. So thank you.